All right, guys, welcome back. So we've been working with jQuery for a little bit, and I understand it may seem foreign for a few reasons. And so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to replicate a type of jQuery. We're going to be creating a class called jQuery, and we're going to be learning how to do the same things that jQuery has built into it. So we're going to be focused on adding classes. And so let's go ahead and learn about removing classes as well. What we're going to do is we're going to first talk about jQuery itself and how it targets things. And this is one of the reasons why jQuery looks like it's its own thing, which it's not. By the way, we can easily write something like this. So the first thing we're going to discuss is the dollar symbol here. And I mean, this looks like its own thing. This does not look like JavaScript. And that's one of the ways that jQuery looks like its own unique little bit of code or its own thing, but it's not, because the dollar sign there is the equivalent to writing the word jQuery. And now when you do this here looks like looks a little more like a function, and that's essentially what it is. It's a class declaration. You could actually go and replace all of the dollar signs in your code with the word jQuery. Note that capital Q right there, and everything would still work. So essentially, the dollar sign is just a synonym for the word jQuery. Now that's very important because we're going to be doing all of this on our own, and this is going to be so fun. So again, we're just going to focus right now on adding a class and just selecting elements by class name. So we're only going to be targeting by class name. So we don't need the little symbol in the front. This tells it it's an ID, and basically we don't need that or the dot preceding the class name. So in my index.html file, I have added a class to the paragraph here called mySelector, and this is going to allow us to select the element within our own jQuery library. And we're going to call it jQuery because I'm not going to call it jQuery. I don't want it to clash with the name there. So in my JavaScript directory, I'm going to go ahead and create a new JavaScript file, and I'm going to call it jQuery. And that's just because my last name starts with G. You guys can name this whatever you want, just consistently refer to it. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, obviously, is going to include this within my HTML file. So the script source is going to be js/jQuery.js. I'm going to save this. And at this point, we shouldn't get an error, and we don't, so that's good. Now, drop down in the jQuery file to a new line. If you're using WebStorm, it does add that little comment at the top. You can remove that if you want. What we're going to do is we're just going to define a class called jQuery. And it's going to be all lowercase for a different reason. We're not going to be instantiating the class using the new keyword or assigning it to a variable or anything like that, as we have done in previous videos. We are going to create an access function for that. So let's go ahead and create a class and call it jQuery. Now, within the jQuery class, within the constructor, we need to be able to pass in the target. So go ahead and create a constructor. And we're going to pass in EL as the elements that we're going to be targeting. In this case, it's always going to be targeting class, so we don't have to do any additional logic within this function. We just need to get the elements by the class name. So go ahead and write this.elements equals document.get elements by class name, and then pass in EL. Right there. So that's all we need to do in the constructor. And now we can't really do anything with this yet. And so we're going to create a function. So I'm going to save this and refresh. Now, normally when you create a class, what you would have to do to instantiate it, which we can right now, we can create a variable called s, yeah, that's fine, equals new jQuery. It's all lowercase, jQuery. And then we're going to pass in my-selector. I'm going to save this and refresh. Now if I type S, It says it's undefined because it's not at the global space, it's within the jQuery document ready. But this is normally how you would do this, but we don't want this. We don't want to have to use the new keyword. So how we're going to do this is we're going to create a function in here in our jQuery library called jQuery with the capital Q. And we're going to pass in the element into that. This is what we're going to be accessing, and this is going to go ahead and instantiate this and return it. So our element equals new jQuery, and we're going to pass in the target like that, and then we're just going to return element. And I'm going to save this and refresh. Now what we can do is we can just call jQuery and my dash selector. And now this is our jQuery object, and we see we do have our element right there. So it has successfully targeted by class name and selected it. Now within the jQuery class, we're going to create a method called addClass. And what we're going to pass into here is the string representation of the class name that we want to add. So I'm just going to abbreviate it as CL. And then open that up. Now what we need to do is, where this is a class, it can have multiple elements, and actually any element we're going to be passing in here will be an array. So we need to do a loop. So we're going to create a count variable. We're going to set that to 0. Then we're going to open up a for loop, and we're going to add a class as defined here, passed into this method, to each element within this dot elements. So while count is less than this dot elements dot length, we're going to set the class name to whatever we pass in here. So this dot elements, we're going to target the current element in the array, and then dot class name. Now this is a getter and setter, so we could just call this and it would just get the existing class property, and it would just, like, we could print it out, for example. But what we're going to do is we're going to append our new class to the end of this property for this element. So we're going to go plus equals, and then really we just need to put that like that. And it's going to add whatever we tell it to into the class name list. Now this will not work because generally when you add a class, there's no space at the end, and so it will add it with no space. So what we have to do is we need to concatenate the value that we're changing to include a space, just like this. So we've got a count. Now this isn't going to work right now because we need to increase the count by 1 each time it loops through here, but let's go over this so far. We've got a count variable set to 0. We're saying while this count variable is less than the length of this element, do this to the current element. And then we go ahead and say count plus plus. So I'm going to save this. And in the main.js file now, we don't have to do that. We could if we wanted to, but we don't need to. So let's go ahead and make this happen, and then we'll discuss it a little bit more. So I'm just going to say jQuery my dash selector, and then immediately we're going to call the add class method, and I'm going to say add my new class. Now this kind of looks like jQuery, and that's exactly what we're going for. In jQuery, you would put the little dot here in front so that jQuery knows that it's a class name you're targeting. We don't need to do that. We're just assuming that at this point. It's a given. So I'm going to save this and refresh this, and as you can see, we have added a new class by that name to the paragraph element. So that was pretty quick, and I may have gone a little too fast. We're going to review this really quickly, and then we're also going to add the ability to target multiple elements, or rather different types of elements. So we create a class called jQuery, which is only accessible by this function here. So this is the function that we call, and it returns that element. Now, when we create the class, we construct it with the target, which right now is just a class. So we can safely say this elements equals get elements by class name. This is going to change. And we also have a method in here that we call directly on the object that we create, which means we don't store it in a variable and we don't do anything like that. We just we instantiate it, we construct it, and then we call add class on it. And in here, we take the name of the class, where's that, of the class that we want to add. So in this case, it's just my new class. We create a variable, set it 0, then we loop over them. You guys know how to do loops, so I'm not going to spend too much time in here. And then we use regular JavaScript code to do what we want to do. So that's how to create a jQuery library. Now, at this point, we are going to introduce the ability to target by class or ID. So in jQuery right here in the constructor, we need to determine if there is a dot or a hash symbol in the element variable. So if, one sec. All right, guys, sorry about that. Just had to take a call. So I believe we were just talking about extending this to be able to target IDs and classes. So we're going to check if el.indexOf dot is more than -1, which means dot would appear in the string at least once. We're going to set this elements to that. Else if el.indexOf a hash symbol, we're going to do things a little bit different. We have to say if it's more than -1. We're going to say this dot elements equals, we need to put it into an array simply because we're referencing it as an array everywhere. So even if there's just one element, because it's an ID, even if there's just one element, it still needs to be in an array. So then we're going to say document.get element by ID, and then we're going to pass in el there. And we're going to do something else if there's no element passed into it, which let's just assume there is, but if there is not, we're just going to set it to the document. So this dot elements equals document. And we might be able to use that. We may have to change it to window later on, I'm not sure. But we can, at this point we could instantiate it without an element, but then nothing would work. So let's go ahead and save this. Now I'm going to update this to select by a class name. So now it says .mySelector. And actually we need to do one more thing. We need to remove the selector from the name before we do anything. So we need to strip it. So stripping, let's say, replace. So if we have a string, it starts with el and we go replace, and we replace that with nothing, and then it returns just that. That's exactly what we need to do in this case. So we'll go ahead and say el dot replace dot with nothing. And then down here we need to do the same thing for the ID. So we go el dot replace, and we're going to replace that with nothing as well. And so those first symbols there, the hash sign or the dot, they're only used to tell jQuery what kind of element targeting we're doing. So I'm going to save this and refresh, and something has broken. Something has gone terribly wrong. Did I save this so we can select it correctly? All right, so that's not the problem. So let's look at this. All right, let's go ahead and right in here in the beginning in the constructor, let's console log el so that we can see if we're making contact with that, and we are. So el is index of that, so we're going to copy this down here. Console log that there, and it's still printing out with the dot. try with the single quotes. Save it, refresh. Now it's still printing that out. So if it's index of a dot, something is terribly wrong there. Can I make it equal that? There we go. And as you see now, we've got that. So I guess it doesn't return it as itself. It doesn't modify the existing object. It just would create it like a copy. So we need to do the same thing down here. We update the EL element to equal the same element without the special character at the beginning. So save this. Now if we have an ID, I can do the same thing, and we have ID main here. So in our main JavaScript file, we're going to say jQuery main. We're going to add class of hello. Save this, refresh, and now this has a class of hello. However, it has a space at the beginning. So what we need to do, or what we can do, we don't need to, it'll still work, is if the element has a class name, then append it, otherwise set it. So we're going to say if this dot elements count class name, we're going to just append the new class name to it, else we're just going to set the class name. So this elements count class name equals CL. So I'm going to save it. We're going to refresh. And now you can see that it has added this class without a space, and it has added this class with a space. And so you guys at this point can probably imagine all the different things you can do with jQuery and gQuery now. Anything that jQuery does, you can definitely copy it and build your own library if you want to. And I hope this, if you guys had trouble understanding exactly how jQuery worked before, hopefully this made it a little easier in understanding, because now you guys could do the same thing if you wanted to.